Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to class. Today we'll start a series of videos that there will talk about emergence of sociolinguistics as an independent discipline. Why we are doing this? We are doing this to underline a historical development in the field of linguistics, where this new discipline emerged out of core linguistics and gained currency and popularity and was established as an independent discipline by a few scholars in the field who are also known as founding fathers of modern social linguistics. Uh, by doing this, we are not denying the fact that language and society, relationship between language and society, and the role of language in social configuration, relationship between language and society, such themes have already been explored, and people have done a lot of good work in that. uh, you know Notable contributions we can see Ferdinand de Saussure's structural linguistics, that he talks about la langue, la parole, ideas like synchrony, diachrony, and other dichotomies of Saussure. So language and its relationship with society was explored. But why we are doing a separate series on this theme is to underline the fact that a new wave of interest and scholarship emerged in 1960s, which had a different approach in looking at language from this sociological perspective, that angle. People have worked, like anthropologists, sociologists like Edward Sapir, Benjamin Lee Worf. They have already worked in the field and contributed a lot. But 1960s, the decade has proved to be so fertile and so distinct that we'll focus on a few scholars who truly contributed in the emergence of this discipline as an independent discipline with a new approach. So the interest in language and society was not new, and it's not the case that it emerged in 1960s. But why 1960s as a decade is important, we'll learn very shortly. So we are going to talk about emergence of sociolinguistics as an independent discipline. Sociolinguistics, a compound word, a term, has two components: socio, that refers to society, and linguistics, a discipline which studies language. So these two disciplines merge together. Uh, so sociolinguistic study of it's a social study of language, a scientific study of social aspects of language. So how language interacts, negotiates in society, right? What prompts the user of the language to use a particular variety, right? With a particular variant in a socio-cultural context, in a socio-cultural space. How a speaker constructs identity and reflects and expresses solidarity with the community, speech community. So these are the thrust areas of social linguistics. It focuses on the relationship between language structures and social. We'll come to this relationship in a while. Uh, Social linguistics is more of looking at language in actual socio-cultural context, language used in actual socio-cultural context. And we'll talk about Delham's communicative competence as a response to the generative linguistic theory by Chomsky. Uh, Variation is a very central theme of modern social linguistics. It all started with William Lebov, and how that tradition continues, and how this study of variation vis-a-vis social class, gender, you know, geographical location, cultural space, other indexes and factors, how they factor in understanding language variation, how these variations are triggered by certain socio-cultural components, certain socio-cultural factors. We'll talk about it. That is the major thrust area of social linguistics, modern social linguistics, and study of language variation. So, language is not only used for communication. Language is not only about exchanging ideas and sharing opinion and views, information. It's beyond that. It constructs the identity of the speaker, right? A speaker represents the solidarity, reflects the solidarity with the speech community he or she is located in. And there are certain other factors which are central to the study of language in this newly emerged discipline called sociolinguistics. How it emerged, uh, we have to understand the background of it. So, dialectology, philology, dialectology, historical linguistics, these were the established fields, and you know, uh, dialectology looked at language from language in relation to the geographical location. So, how the change in geography, how the change in space brings in changes in language. Uh, the systematic study of variations in dialects began in mid 19th century, but carried on in late 19th century. It was also called dialectal geography. It was a subdiscipline of linguistics. However, the focus of dialectology as a subdiscipline of linguistics was different. The objectives were different, and there was no focus on social factors in language use and change. So these changes were purely studied in terms of linguistic changes. The structures were studied purely in terms of linguistic structures, and there was no focus on a relationship between linguistic structures and social structures. It was more of linguistic variation that dialectology studied. Uh, so the objective of dialectology was to register language use, focus on regional variants, documenting individual place dialects, linguistic geographical data, producing linguistic maps, analyzing language variation in terms of phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and lexis, word to words, and it ignored the social aspect of language use. So, this was the objective of the dialectology. However, uh, it changed after 1950s. And why late 50s was so important will come in a while. But let's first talk about what methods they used. So they used tape recorders and roamed around and recorded speeches. They targeted the rural population, which was non-mobile, and in the rural population they targeted older people, elderly people who were non-mobile and preferably not educated. So they saw them as a source of raw data. People who did not travel, and you know, so they were the one who were seen as a source of authentic data in this study. So it shows the biased choice of informants. They used to collect list of items, isolated words, how they are used, a few sentences, how these words are used in those sentences, so syntactic structures, morphological changes, accent changes, and pronunciation. These were the focus areas of this dialectological study. And they used questionnaires, both written and oral, and they recorded the respondents and their responses. So this was the method used in dialectology, and you can see that there was hardly any focus or discussion on you know, the social factor of such changes, such variations. The social factors in in change of linguistic structures in terms of pronunciation, choice of words, syntactic structures, morphosyntactic elements. So the entire focus was on linguistic variation. However, the social variation and social index did not figure out in these studies, and that's why what I was talking about 1960s idea of doing linguistics with relation to society was so different. Now we need to understand the development and the background of 1960s. So let's start with 1950s and why these 2 decades are so crucial to understand. If you look at the uh, early works and early developments in the field of linguistics, of course, Ferdinand de Saussure is called modern father of modern linguistics. So Saussurean, structuralism, and then we have this Bloomfieldian's idea, Leonard Bloomfield, and then we have this you know, Zelling Harris and other people working in the field. 50s was dominated by behaviorist idea, behaviorist paradigm, and structuralism, where we see the last monumental work. I say last because after that things changed. So that was a historical development. So in 1957, B.F. Skinner came up with his monumental work, verbal behavior, that we have already talked about. And this behaviorist paradigm looked at language as human verbal behavior. So it was part of total human behavior. So the whole idea of tabula rasa and stimulus response and operant conditioning, and uh, so lots of stimulus response chain, operant conditioning, and reinforcement. So all these ideas were prevalent and dominant. This approach was severely criticized by Noam Chomsky. And 1957 is the year which is marked with arrival of a new paradigm. So dominant paradigm was behaviorism, and which was questioned and criticized by Chomsky, and he came up with generative paradigm. So his 1965 publication changed the whole discourse and approach in looking at language, and he set the goal of linguistic theory to be understanding and predicting the competence, linguistic competence of the speakers or the users, and his focus was mainly on computational aspect of language. So language and mind and computational aspect. This is what he focused on. He had no exclusive argument and nothing to offer directly, in the sense that the other people looked at language as as a means of communication, and language use was of prime importance to them. So if you look at the Chomsky idea of linguistic
competence and linguistic performance that were challenged by uh, people like Dalhams, Emeka Halliday, right? Uh, they talked about communicative competence. Dalhams particularly coined this term communicative competence that equates with the linguistic performance. So, language in use was the primary object of study in linguistics as a reaction to Chomsky's abstract idea of language and mind and linguistic competence. Very envisages ideal speaker and hearer situation, speech community, and the competence is not restricted by other external factors like memory loss, occupied mind, and some other things. And the idea of universal grammar, the idea of language acquisition device, the idea of principles and parameters, and all that, this entire Chomsky enterprise was questioned and criticized by a group of scholars. Of course, Dalhams and people like Emeka Halliday led it from front. So this Chomsky theory was gaining currency and getting popularity. And there was another parallel group that was working on the performance aspect of the language, like Dalhams for that matter, Emeka Halliday for that matter. In 1963, uh, you know, uh, William Lebob worked on his MA dissertations, where he talked about uh, language use in Martha Vineyard Island, and he tried to establish the social stratification, the social class, and the age, which was a prime factor in raised diphthongs and lower diphthongs in Martha Vineyard Island, where the group identity was so prominent that this raising of the vowel became an identity marker, and the islanders who did not like outsiders or visitors on the island tried to create a group of a group of an collective identity where they deliberately by choice used a raised vowel, and how that age was a factor. So William Lebow was the first to show the social factors which were primarily responsible for this linguistic variation, this language use. His another study in social stratification of language in New York study, he established the class and the other social factors which are primarily responsible for variation in the language. So William Willibob's methodology, technique, and the result of its studies established the dominant role of social factors in such language changes, in such language variations in use, and that established a definite and different school of doing linguistics, where the social factors factored in primarily in understanding such linguistic variations. So, right from dialectology, where linguistic variations were attributed to geographical locations, these social factors factored in within the semi-speech community for these variations. And from there, we have a variationist tradition that started. So, you know, uh, rural dialectology moved to urban dialectology, and we see linguistic atlas of United States. The focus shifted from rural dialectology to urban dialects, and again, interest and the objective of such study remain the same. But what I was talking about William Lebow, in 60s, we see a change. And people like William Lebov, people like Basil Bernstein, people like Dalheims, people like John Gumpers, people like Charles Ferguson, and people like Joshua Fishman. These six people are considered father of modern sociolinguistics. However, the contribution of people like William Bright, Ellen Grimshaw, right, Ionar Hugen, Uriel Wendrich, and Suzanne Irwin Tripp cannot be ruled out. So these 11 people were primarily responsible for shaping this discipline. So their works, their contributions shaped the discipline, and what we know today as social linguistics, it all started in 60s. So if you look at William Lebov, who pioneered the work in variation studies, developed and devoted to showing the relevance of social determinants of variation for linguistic theory. So social determinants like age, like gender, like social class, ethnicity. So all these determinants factor in linguistic changes, linguistic variations. The British sociologist Basil Bernstein worked on class related codes. So, how class becomes a very important social determinant to understand the language use. Then, people like Dalheims worked on ethnography of communication, and his focus was more on language use in a socio-cultural space. So, Dalheims shaped the ethnography of communication and educational linguistics, who molded social linguistics by editing several pioneer volumes and of the flagship journal called Language in Society. Then people like John Gumpers worked on interactional social linguistics. People like Charles Ferguson worked on diglossia. His contribution, his major contribution is the idea of diglossia, a social linguistic situation where two varieties of the same language, or in some cases, two different languages, are used within the same speech community for two different social functions. And he calls one code as H code, the other code as L code. H means high and low, L means low. However, with a caveat, he says that naming these codes H and L have no hierarchical distinction. It's all about giving a particular term to a particular variety. And of course, H language or H code will have high prestige value, and L language or L code will have low prestige value, used in informal settings, very dynamic in nature, and likely to change frequently at a very high speed. However, H variety, which enjoys high prestige and used in formal domains, and degree of formality is very high. It has written form, uh, so it will be more restricted and reluctant to change. So it retains its structures and form almost like uniform and standard, which does not undergo frequent changes. So Ferguson's idea of diglossia was a major breakthrough, and then other contributions as well shaped the discipline. Then we have Joshua Fishman, who worked on sociology of language. And there was a huge debate and a lot of overlapping ideas about sociology of calling the discipline sociology of language or social linguistics, right? So he is one of the major contributors in shaping the discipline. Then the people like William Wright, who worked on native languages and cultures of California and places around it, and his serious contribution, his very scholarly contribution in the research on Native American languages is pioneer and very important to understand this discipline. He was one of the people who shaped the discipline. Then Ellen Grimshaw worked on language and social context. She visited India in 1961, and that gave a lot of inspiration to him. And he worked on language in social contexts. People like Einar Huygen, basically a person of language planning, worked on bilingualism and language shift. He was the first linguist to write about ecology of language. Study of Norwegian language planning was a groundbreaking work he produced, and he is credited for many other contributions. And he is one of the uh, you know founding fathers of modern social linguistics that we are talking about. Then Uriel Wenrich, he is another person whose seminal work for understanding language contact, minority languages, and language revival is very important and significant in the field. Then Suzanne Irwin Tripp, a psychologist, also contributed majorly in shaping this discipline, and her work on distinction between compound and coordinate bilingualism and child language acquisition cross culturally. Uh, she is credited for these contributions in understanding the discipline and shaping the discipline in the present form. In our coming lectures, what we are planning, will have a separate lecture on each of these people about their journey as a linguist, about their contribution and impact of their work on the discipline, in the discipline. So we'll talk about all of these contributors and all of these scholars, researchers who shaped the field of modern sociolinguistics. And if you look at their contributions, they're all contemporary. And if you look at their contributions, the decade of 1960 was very crucial and very fertile. And these people started with this approach, new approach. Variationist tradition was pioneered by Lebov. You know, linguistic interactions by John Gumpers, sociology of language by Joshua Fishman, and then people like Charles Ferguson, who talked about diglossia. People like William Wright, who talked about Native American languages and cultures, right? People like Basil Bernstein about class and code. People about like Alan Grimshaw, language in context. So all these people have contributed together, and we can have more names to the credit in shaping this discipline. But we will have a separate lecture on these 11 founding fathers of social linguistics whose original work give shape to this discipline and outlined the major thrust areas of the discipline. And this is how a new independent discipline emerged with these people. If you quickly look at the methodology, how it changed from dialectology, methods in dialectology, to methods in modern social linguistics. If you look at the methodology used by William Lebov, observer's paradox is an idea, is a phenomenon that all scholars working in the area of language and society or social linguistics, they should maintain, where the respondent is not aware and is not at least conscious of the fact that his speech is being recorded, right? Uh, it has to be as informal and casual as possible. Setting has to be very informal and casual. Then only we can have the real speech sample. And Lebov survey, he observed this observer's paradox. We'll talk about observer's paradox in one of our lectures later on. And identifying social linguistic variables, we'll talk about it later on. And he disguised himself as a customer in his New York study and asking a question to all possible identified respondents: where can I find the lady's shoe? And he was studying this ra sound as a social linguistic variable. Of course, the answer would be fourth floor. And here we see the occurrence of this sound in both the words. And it was in a spontaneous response to his question. So anybody passing by would answer fourth floor, right? And this is how he collected his data. So observer's paradox remains a very, very important and significant phenomena to maintain during data collections for such studies, where the respondent does not have to be careful, cautious, and aware and intimidated, and the interviewer or the researcher has to create a very informal and casual setting so that the real speech comes out. It's also important to understand social linguistic variable. So if you are studying sound changes, right, you need to identify what sound can act as a social linguistic variable. So we'll talk about social linguistic variables and how do we identify them in some other class. But this is it for now, where we have just initiated this series of talking about social linguistics as an independent discipline, how it emerged, and who are the people who are considered founding fathers of modern social linguistics, their journey about the journey in the field, the journey in this research, and how their contributions shaped this discipline, and how their contributions set the tone and the major thrust areas of the discipline. So we'll continue with all these people in separate videos, and we'll have one video for each one of them separately, underlining their journey as linguists, their contributions, their approach, their techniques used, and their contributions and impact of their contributions in the discipline. So this is it for now. Thank you very much. We'll talk about other aspects that I have just highlighted in some other video. For now, thank you very much.